So as a former atheist, once in a while I like to talk about atheism and contrast where I used to be with where I have currently arrived to. Now this would be a little bit different than a typical creation talk, because typical creation talks usually talk about a lot of evidence. That's vital and fun and very interesting, but it also helps to stand back a little bit and talk about how we interpret that evidence. So that's kind of my goal here tonight. Now, before I start that, I should answer a question that some of you might have. Are you actually in the right place? Because if you saw promotional materials for this meeting tonight, you were expecting this guy, and you got someone who doesn't look like this guy, so what's going on? Well, this guy was before a certain virus arrived in Washington State and the governor closed all the barbershops. So if you're wondering about the discrepancy, that's what's going on there. And my background is engineering and space operations. And so, as was mentioned, I do tend to emphasize astronomy and cosmology. And these are fun topics because they ask the big questions. You know, where did it all come from? Why are we here? It blends into a lot of that. And I think it's helpful to contrast different viewpoints based on where we are coming from in our worldviews. So tonight we're going to focus especially on atheism. So what is atheism? Well, atheism comes from the Greek atheos, which literally means no God. So an atheist is someone who believes that there is no God. And you've probably noticed that the past decade or two, this has been a rising tide in our culture. Even when I was growing up as an atheist, it was different being an atheist back then because a lot of people didn't even like the word atheist. Secular humanism was the preferred label. You didn't have the militant atheism that we have today. We didn't certainly have all these variety of books, not only saying that we don't need God, but saying that it's wrong to believe in God. This is an immoral act. And it's actually immoral to even teach this to children. And as an illustration of this, coming from Washington State, where I currently live, we're a little farther ahead down this path than most places in the country, being on the left coast. This is on the sidewalk outside of the public library. These tiles here, and hopefully you can read some of these closer up. Free thinkers tell secular truths. Truth is greater than religion. Jesus was a false prophet. Read Matthew 16 and Mark 9. No gods, no masters. No gods, no masters. No gods, no masters. The public library outside. So we see this big shift in our culture. And I think this is especially illustrated because what's their motivation here? Is it scientific? No. 3 times they're rejecting a master. This is an emotional outburst, really. And interesting too that the only specific religion being criticized here is Christianity. You don't see anything here about Muhammad, for example. And as creationists, and if you've been a creationist for a while, it's sometimes hard to understand why this debate, this discussion has gotten this divisive. Because surely there's all this evidence for our point of view. And how is it that someone can look at the same evidence we're looking at and yet arrive at different conclusions? And some of you might have seen this video that came out of Harvard University, by the way, not partly a bastion of Christian thought, showing some of the machinery that operates at the cellular level. And this is, I'm not going to take the time to go through this whole video and explain everything that's happening here. But as we've understood more and more what happens at this level, this happens to be inside of a white blood cell, incidentally. We see this not only amazing complexity in design, but structure. We see industrial engineering principles in the way it's laid out and operates. It's a manufacturing operation. All the things that an industrial engineer would do in an American factory, or not American, just any modern factory, is represented here in different ways. It's even frugal in how it uses things. It builds structures out of various materials, and then when those structures are no longer needed, tears them down and recycles the parts and uses them elsewhere. And again, we could do a whole talk just on this and all the amazing complexity going on down there. One thing that people typically are most impressed by is coming up here in just a moment. The cell has to move materials around inside of itself. This is a motor protein. It actually looks like this. You have these inside all of your cells going on right now. This little guy transports stuff, in this case a vacuole full of materials, around inside of the cell for various purposes. Moves raw materials over to here, they get manufactured into little molecular machines and then distributed elsewhere and so on. My point is, this is amazingly complex. A lot of this we're still discovering today, trying to figure out how all this works. How is it that someone could look at this and deny that there's an intelligent designer behind it? In other areas of science, we see, for example, there's carbon-14 in objects that are supposed to be old. Why is that significant? Well, carbon-14 is radioactive and it decays. And it decays fairly quickly. Even if the entire Earth were made of carbon-14, it would all be gone and decay into other elements in just a million years. Yet we find it, let me back a minute. Therefore, if you still find carbon-14 in a sample, that sample has to be old, just a few thousand years, typically. Even if there's some left after more than a few tens of thousands, it gets too hard to measure. So if you find carbon-14 in a sample, that means it's only thousands of years old, not millions, certainly not billions. Yet we find it in things that are supposed to be much older than thousands. We find it in petrified wood, for example, typically thought to be millions of years old, but it contains carbon-14, which indicates it's only thousands of years old. We find it inside of coal. Again, supposed to be millions of years old. Apparently it's not because it still contains this. We find it in oil, not millions of years old, apparently, only thousands. Now, creationists have been pointing these sorts of things out, and the usual rejoinder from the other side is that, well, your samples are not being processed correctly by the laboratory, or they're being contaminated somehow. Well, first of all, we're using the same laboratories you do, so if it doesn't work for us, it doesn't work for you either. But second of all, a certain geophysicist took samples from inside of a diamond and sent those in, and it turns out diamonds have carbon-14 inside of them too. Now, diamonds are supposed to be over 1 billion years old, and as the hardest known natural substance, you can't get contamination into it from the outside. Yet there's carbon-14 still in there. That indicates it's only thousands of years old. Even the favorite topic of many people, dinosaurs, dinosaur tissues have been found to have carbon-14 inside of it. And Fred mentioned the dinosaur soft tissue website. I'm sure most of us are already familiar with this, but they found soft tissue in dinosaur bones. Soft, stretchy flesh, still there. Can you have this? Can you have blood vessels and blood cells preserved over millions of years? No, you can't. It's amazing that they even lasted thousands, never mind millions. And by the way, for more information on this, I would recommend the site that Fred mentioned, dinosaursofttissue.com, right? It's all one word, where Bob kept an extensive list of these sorts of discoveries. Because after this one, which was the first major one that hit the media, people have been looking for more and finding it. It's been there the whole time. But because people believe in millions of years, most people, and at least active scientists tend to believe this, then they weren't looking for these sorts of things, because why would you waste your time if you already knew they were millions of years old and couldn't have this? So we see biology, we see geology, paleontology, even in astronomy. My videos out on the table out there focus on this specifically. You can go through the solar system planet by planet, which is actually what the first video does, and show that each one causes different problems for secular ideas about how they got there. In fact, some of the worst problems are found in the gas and ice giant planets. Those planets shouldn't exist at all, according to the secular ideas about where they came from, but yet there they are nonetheless. We could talk, if we had time, about star formation. Stars shouldn't be there either, according to secular ideas. All the ideas about how they form all require stars to exist first to make new ones. So the question of where did the first generation come from is a real problem. And even some secular folks will admit this. This is one of my astrophysics textbooks. This author said literally hundreds of ideas on how stars are formed have been advanced in past decades, but we are still far from any real solution. Looking on a larger scale yet, galaxies also pose problems for secular explanations. Trying to explain galactic structure and galactic clusters and superclusters also poses big problems. As this author said, the formation of galaxies and larger scale structure remains TMI UPI-MA, the most important unsolved problem in modern astrophysics. Now I could talk for a whole presentation just about evidence, and I'm sure most of the talks here do that, and again, that's great. But the other side is aware of all these things already. That's because this debate is not just about the evidence, it's about the worldview that you use to interpret that evidence. So what is a worldview? Well, a worldview is the lenses through which you view the world around you. You can think of it like a pair of sunglasses. When you put sunglasses on, everything appears darker, right? Because it's filtering light before it reaches the eyes. Well, a worldview is like a pair of sunglasses you can never take off. Or at least if you take it off, you have to put on a different one immediately. You always have to be wearing one worldview glasses or another. And this applies to all of us. This isn't a creation versus evolution thing. This is just how we work. You put a lot of credibility in your worldview without even thinking about it, because these are the assumptions that you make about the world around you. And if you think about how strong your worldview is, it will actually override what your senses tell you. For example, this used to be a corny trick in magic shows where a magician would show you the emptiness of a hat and then immediately pull a rabbit out of this hat that you just saw didn't have anything in it. Now, this is a cliche, of course. But if you were to see this happen in front of you, would you believe that a magician popped a rabbit into existence out of nothing? No, you assume it's a trick, right? Why? Because your worldview tells you that rabbits don't pop into existence out of nothing. Your worldview is leading you to deny the evidence of your own eyes rather than question your worldview. So worldviews are very foundational to how we interpret the world around us, and this applies in the creation evolution debate as well. We have the same evidence on both sides, but yet we reach different conclusions. Why is that? Well, because each side is applying a different worldview. We look at biology, for example. Now, the Christian has a biblical worldview and says, look at all this amazing evidence for God's abilities as an intelligent designer and a magnificent engineer. All this complexity, all the structure, the density of information storage, all these amazing things. It proclaims God's abilities. The evolutionist, an atheist, looks at this from his atheistic worldview and says, wow, isn't it amazing what random natural processes can do over millions of years, natural selection and all the rest of it. Neo-Darwinian processes can make things that look designed, apparently. Dawkins actually said something similar to that. The Christian looks at carbon-14 and old items and says, well, apparently they're not actually old. These things are only thousands of years old, not millions of years old. The atheist says, well, apparently these samples are getting contaminated somehow, or something else is going on that I don't know, I don't understand. Christian says, well, look, dinosaur soft tissue, obviously only thousands of years old. Atheist says, well, what do you know? Blood and soft tissue can last millions of years after all. Christian says, look at the glory of God proclaimed in the heavens. Atheist says it's just the result of the laws of physics operating over long periods of time. So you understand the point here. Both of us, both sides in this debate, we have our own worldview, and we're kind of butting heads on this because it's not an issue of what we see. Everybody agrees on what we see. The question is, how do you interpret what we see? And both sides feel that they're on strong footing, but there's a difference. One side is right, and the other side is wrong. The atheist worldview actually contradicts itself. The atheist, coming from his worldview, does not have a leg to stand on because his worldview is wrong. And that's our main topic of the presentation tonight. There's various areas we could discuss this in to show that the Christian worldview supports these things, whereas the atheist worldview does not. And I will talk about some of these tonight. I don't have time to cover all of them. But my main point is, as Christians who believe in the Bible, we can believe in morality, purpose, ethics, mathematics, laws of logic, and science. The atheist, however, can't actually believe in any of those things, at least not while being consistent with his atheistic beliefs. So for an atheist to try to use these things in an argument, he actually has to first assume that they're true, which means he's inherently assuming that the Bible is true because the Bible provides the foundation for those things, whereas his atheistic worldview does not. So for an atheist to try to use, for example, science in an argument against the Bible, is kind of like a silly person sending you an email who says, I don't believe in email, email doesn't exist. Well, that's ridiculous because he had to use email in order to send that message to you. Similarly, for an atheist to try to use science, logic, mathematics, etc., to try to disprove the Bible, he's actually endorsing the Bible in doing so because that's the only correct foundation for these things. So in actually using, for example, scientific arguments, he's using an argument that actually disproves his own position as he's making it. And we're going to focus tonight on science and the requirements for it, that being of great interest to us. So we should ask first, what is science? Well, science comes from the Latin word scientia, meaning knowledge. And I found there's different definitions for this. I like this one. Science is a systematic enterprise that builds and organizes knowledge in the form of testable explanations and predictions about the universe. So I thought that was a pretty good description. Now, science, of course, is based on the scientific method. Now, there's different formulations for the scientific method, but here's a rough one, and tell me if you agree with this. It's a several-step process. You start out with the desire to understand the universe and how it all works. So you need motivation. Step 2 is you make observations about the world around you and you gather data. Step 3, you generate a hypothesis based on that data, and you're trying to figure out, why did these things happen that I saw in my experiments? You come up with an explanation, and we call that a hypothesis. Based on that hypothesis, you then make predictions for conditions that you haven't observed yet. You know what happened in your experiments, but now you're going to use your hypothesis to predict what will happen in other experiments that you haven't done yet, in conditions you haven't observed yet. And then you run those experiments and you test the predictions that you made based on the hypothesis. Now, depending on who you ask, some people will rearrange some of the steps here. In particular, some people would say that you make the hypothesis before you gather data, but whatever, it doesn't matter for our purposes tonight. Does everyone agree this is a pretty good explanation of how the scientific method works?
Yeah.
Right? Okay, and here's an example of this. Let's say I want to understand why things fall. I noticed that if I were to drop something, open my hand, it'll fall to the ground. Why does it do that? Well, first of all, I observe how this happens under various conditions. I think maybe it depends on the masses and the distance between the things as to how exactly all that happens. I then formulate my ideas as a mathematical description. You may recognize the formula for gravity here. And then I use that mathematical formulation to run experiments and make predictions and measure what happened, and compare that to what my math said and see if I'm correct. So that's an example of how the scientific method works. And this is a good process. This is a very effective process. All the advancements we've made in science are due ultimately to this procedure. But in order for this procedure to work, you have to make certain assumptions. And some of these assumptions are so foundational, you probably didn't even think about them as I went through this list. For example, to start out with the desire to understand the universe, and you want to know how it all works, well, in order for that to be possible, the universe must first exist. I told you it was foundational, right? It seems so obvious that you probably didn't even think about that, but yet, obviously it does have to be true in order for the scientific method to work, right? Also, a self-consistent understanding of how the universe works must be possible. We'll talk more about that here in a moment. In order to make observations and gather data, we must be able to trust our senses and our brains to accurately communicate conditions in the world around us to our brain, right? Step 3, to create a hypothesis, well, the universe must operate in an orderly fashion. There's no point in trying to figure out how it works if it doesn't actually work in a way that can be figured out, right? Also, logical deduction must be possible because we have to take various pieces of data and deduce from those some relationship, and thus from there make a prediction, which requires that we must be able to use mathematics, because that's what the prediction will be couched in. And the last step, to test the predictions, means the universe has to operate in an orderly fashion, and we have to be able to use logical induction to apply our hypothesis to conditions that we haven't observed yet. And you might not be familiar with that last step. I'll explain what it is here in a little bit. But my point for now is, in order for the scientific method to work, all of those assumptions must be true. Do we all agree with that? So essentially, since the scientific method is the foundation of science and making progress in science, these assumptions are therefore the foundation of the scientific method. So these 7 assumptions are 7 requirements for science to be possible. If any one of these assumptions is not true, then you can't use science. Now, I'm going to argue here tonight that as Christians, we can affirm that all 7 of these things are true because the Bible says they are. However, an atheist can't affirm any of them. His worldview denies all of them, if you really take his worldview to the logical conclusion. Therefore, an atheist can't consistently do science. And by consistently, I mean consistent with his atheism. So let's talk about these assumptions. Number 1, the universe must exist. Well, does the universe exist? As Christians, we can say yes, because the Bible says it does. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Well, God created the universe, therefore, we can say it exists. What about the atheist who doesn't have the Bible to rely on as a foundation? From his perspective, can he say the universe exists? Well, he'll say, well, yes, I can observe it. Therefore, it's there. Well, wait a minute, Mr. Atheist. We haven't yet established that you can trust your senses. That's a different assumption we'll talk about here in a bit. So given that that's not yet established, your observations aren't actually useful. How do you know the universe exists? Well, a lot of people, if you challenge them on this, they'll just kind of scratch your head and their head rather, and they'll just say, well, this is a stupid conversation. Obviously it exists. The more thoughtful among them, however, will say, wait a minute, I don't actually need to observe the universe to prove that it exists. In fact, a thinker a while back came up with a great way to capture this in a little pithy quote. René Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. You've probably heard this. He was actually trying to figure out what could he use as the foundation for knowledge. What did he know for sure that was true, and then you could make deductions from there. So his first step was, well, I'm thinking about this problem. Therefore, if there's thoughts, there must be a thinker, so I know I exist. And from there, it doesn't seem to be too far of a step to say, well, if I'm thinking, then I must be doing the thinking somewhere. Therefore, there's a universe around me that I'm doing the thinking within. So the more thoughtful among the atheists will say, I know I exist because I'm thinking. Therefore, the universe must exist too. Unfortunately, though, for him, this reasoning doesn't work. And I'm going to actually save this for later to talk about why that's true. So we'll come back to that at the end of the talk. For now, we'll just talk about how a straightforward look at how an atheist thinks would provide no actual foundation for the universe even existing. What about the second assumption? The idea that a self-consistent understanding of the universe must be possible. Can you actually have a self-consistent explanation for the universe? Well, as Christians, yes, because the Bible says the Lord made it. So where did the universe come from, though? From an atheistic perspective that doesn't accept the creation event. Well, of course, if you're familiar with the consensus views in science, you'll know that the consensus view today is the Big Bang model, that in the beginning there was nothing, and then there was a quantum fluctuation in the nothing, which produced a lot of energy. The energy was expanding and cooling as it did so. It then condensed into matter. The matter gathered into stars and into galaxies. Eventually planets formed, and we formed on those, and here we are looking at it all. I'm focusing in all of this, though, at the very beginning of that. What actually began, according to this? Well, there was a quantum fluctuation from nothing. Well, does that work? Here's a graphic of what the universe looked like before the Big Bang happened. Actually, my slide is failing me. What's going on here? Never mind. We'll get to that in a moment. While discussing this with an atheist, there's a question I like to ask. And if you remember anything from the talk tonight, this is the most practical thing to remember. And that's this 6-word question. Did the universe have a beginning? How many possible answers are there to this question? 2, right? Yes, there was a beginning. Or no, there wasn't a beginning, which means therefore it's always been there. In other words, it's eternal, right? Does everyone agree that these are the only 2 options to answer that question? Okay. I call this question the secular dilemma, and I like mentioning this because this is actually the question that got me, rattled my cage, so to speak, out of my atheism and started me questioning my own worldview. Turns out that when you really look at the implications of this, both of these answers, from an atheistic perspective, violate a law of physics. A different law in each case, but each one does violate a law. So let's talk about that. Let's say, okay, let's look at the answer, yes, there was a beginning. If the universe had a beginning, what was there before that beginning? Well, I talked about this a moment ago. Before the beginning, there was nothing. In other words, the universe looked like this. Of course, that's just an artist's conception. But if that were true, could a universe arise out of that? Can you go from nothing to everything? Can you go from nothing to anything? Well, no, because nothing can create what? Nothing. Nothing can do nothing. From nothing comes nothing. R.C. Sproul once said, if there was ever truly once nothing, there could never be anything. And as Dr. Phil Fernandez once said, you can't tell me nothing made everything. I know too much about nothing. Now, so far, this argument is more of a philosophical claim, right? Turns out, though, you can actually put science behind this. Fundamental physics says this idea doesn't work about something coming from nothing. And the actual principle is called the conservation of mass energy. Now, this is a very fundamental law of physics. Matter and energy are conserved. Their total amount in the universe never changes. This is sometimes called the first law of thermodynamics, by the way. You may have heard it under that term. Physics today understands that matter and energy are different forms of the same thing. So there's an equivalence between them. So you can convert one to the other back and forth, but you can never create either one from nothing because that violates this principle. This principle says the total amount never changes, only the relative amount of each one together. But the combined amount is always the same. So what do I mean by convert back and forth? Well, you can convert matter to energy. The most efficient way we know how to do that is a nuclear explosion. I mean, a little bit of stuff converts into a lot of energy, right? But the energy didn't come from nothing, did it? You needed the bomb first to convert into that energy. We can go the other direction too. We can take a lot of energy and turn it into a little bit of stuff. And we do that in particle accelerators. We take little chunks of matter and get them zipping around at close to the speed of light, smash them together. More stuff comes out of the collisions than went in. And I don't just mean the number of particles, I mean the actual physical stuff there. But we're not making stuff from nothing. We're converting the kinetic energy, the energy of motion that we impart into these things, we're converting that energy into matter. So my point is we can convert matter to energy and energy to matter, but we can never create either one from nothing because that violates some fundamental physics behind all of this. And we even see this principle in our lives every day. I mean, if you think about this, why do we need to eat food every day? Regardless of how difficult that process might sometimes be. Because our bodies need energy to function, can't make that from energy from nothing because that violates physics. So you have to get it from the chemical energy stored in the food. Of course, you actually have to get it in your mouth first, but that's a different problem. Why do we get bills from the power company every month? Because our appliances need energy to operate, can't get it from nothing because that violates physics. So you have to get it from another source, the power company, which also can't make it from nothing because that violates physics. So it has to get it from the chemical energy in coal, or the gravitational potential energy stored in flowing water, or solar energy from the sun. And these sources also don't make it from nothing because that violates physics. The sun burns hydrogen to produce its energy and so on. So we see this principle all through the world around us. In fact, we couldn't even be watching this presentation tonight if this principle weren't true, because some of the principles of circuit design are based on this principle in physics. So this very fundamental law of physics says that there couldn't have been a beginning to the universe. You can't get something from nothing. In other words, there must always have been something. So that first answer has to be wrong. Let's look at the second one then, the idea that there's always been something. Can the universe actually be eternal? Well, physics says no, it can't. For a different law of physics this time, sometimes abbreviated 2LOT, which stands for the second law of thermodynamics. And you've probably heard of this law before. There's different implications of it. I'll probably do a whole talk just on this. There's so much going on here that we can discuss. But I like to use coffee as an illustration of this particular application. So if you walk into the room and there's a hot cup of coffee sitting on the table, how long has it been there? A long time or a short time? Short time. Why? Because it's still hot. It hasn't cooled off yet. It had been there long enough to cool off. It would have done so, right? Can it have been there forever? No. Because if it had been there forever, it would have cooled off forever ago. We can apply the same reasoning to the universe. Is there anything in the universe that hasn't cooled off yet? Stars, right? They're still very hot. If the universe were eternally old, stars wouldn't exist anymore because stars, given enough time, consume all their fuel and die out. Now, some of them will blow up before that happens, but one way or the other, stars go away if you wait long enough. So if the universe were eternally old, stars would have cooled off eternally long ago. We wouldn't see them today, right? Now, some people argue, well, wait a minute, new stars can form. There's actually problems with that from a secular perspective, as I mentioned. But even if that were possible, it still consumes energy of which there's a finite amount in the universe available. If the universe were eternally old, that too would have been consumed eternally long ago. So the fact that we still see stars tells us the universe is not eternally old, right? Just by looking up, we can verify that the universe has not been there forever. And if it hasn't been there forever, that means it must have had what? A beginning. Now, there are Christian ministries, one of which was mentioned earlier actually, that actually promote the idea that Christians need the Big Bang model to prove that the universe had a beginning, because that's consistent with Genesis. Well, actually, the Big Bang model isn't consistent with Genesis. But my point for right now is we don't need the Big Bang model to prove the universe had a beginning. You want to prove the universe had a beginning? Walk outside and look up. Do you see the sun during the day? Do you see stars at night? If so, the universe had a beginning because it hasn't been there forever. So back to our two-part question here. Did the universe have a beginning? We saw, first of all, that the atheist has to say it came from nothing if he chooses that answer, which physics does not allow. So that's off the table. And now we see that the universe also can't be eternal. So that option's off the table. Now, as Christians, we don't have this problem. We can say, yes, the universe is not eternal because we still see stars and etc. Therefore, it had a beginning. But something did not come from nothing on its own. There's a supernatural creator that's responsible for the beginning of the universe. So as Christians, we aren't caught in this trap, but the secular thinker is. Think about this. He only has two options, both of which violate physics. Notice too that this is not about the Big Bang model specifically. Any secular cosmology without a creator must violate physics one way or the other, because the atheist has to pick one of these two options at the beginning of his thinking, and without a creator, he has to violate physics one way or the other. The only explanation that's consistent with all of physics is the biblical one. Yes, the universe had a beginning, but there's a supernatural creator outside of the laws of physics that's responsible for the universe being here. So the laws of physics themselves show that there was a creator. The atheist, however, not wanting to believe in a creator, is caught in a dilemma here. He wants to consistently believe in the validity of the laws of physics, the non-existence of a creator, and the existence of the universe all simultaneously. But as an atheist, he doesn't have that option. Talk about this to an atheist, you might get some objections. For example, he might say, well, we know the universe exists. We can see it. Well, I agree that it exists, Mr. Atheist, but how can it exist? How could it exist if your atheism were true? So assumption number two, that a self-consistent understanding is possible, is denied by a consistently atheist worldview. If you're really going to take your atheism to its logical conclusion, you can't actually come up with an explanation for the universe that doesn't violate physics in one way or the other. Moving onward, assumption three, in order to do science, we have to be able to trust our senses and brains. So we need human ability to observe and comprehend the universe. Can we affirm that this is true? Can we make that assumption? Well, as Christians, yes. The Bible says God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he them, male and female created them. So he created us in his image. We are thinking, conscious creatures who can make observations and draw conclusions. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. That implies that we are capable of perceiving God's glory in the heavens, right? So not only has the Lord created the cosmos, he has given us the ability to perceive things within it, which means we must be able to trust our perception. The Bible says that it's the glory of God to conceal a thing, but the honor of kings is to search out a matter. The Lord has given us the privilege of being able to explore the creation and perceive more of him through it. And like Psalm 8 talks about, when I consider thy heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and stars which you have ordained, that implies we have the ability to consider the heavens and the work of his fingers, right? So I'm hoping I'm not belaboring the point here. The Bible says, yes, you can trust your ability as conscious observers of the universe. The atheist, however, doesn't have that biblical foundation, so he has to come up with some other support for it. Although we believe we're conscious observers of the cosmos, from an atheistic perspective, why should we be conscious? I mean, the Big Bang supposedly made four things: matter, energy, space, and time. Where does consciousness fit into one of those four categories? Because that's all the Big Bang could have made. Not that I believe the Big Bang model. I hope you understand that. But if you do, even if you do believe it, you get to fit everything that exists today into one of those four categories. Is consciousness matter? Is it made of physical stuff? No. Is it energy? No. It's certainly not space or time. Under an atheistic worldview, what are our brains? Our brains are just bags of chemicals that are the result of millions of years of neo-Darwinian processes. How can bags of chemicals be conscious? Can they? The atheist has to think so. Well, atheists have addressed this challenge, and you will sometimes hear them say, well, consciousness is an emergent phenomenon. When matter is arranged in a complicated enough structure, consciousness will emerge from it. Well, show me that in the laboratory, please. Until you do that, I don't accept it, because that sounds, yeah. I'll reserve the adjective I was going to use. Others will say with a straight face, consciousness is an illusion. They will tell you this. You think you're conscious, but you're not. Wait a minute, who thinks he's conscious? Daniel Dennett wrote a whole book promoting this worldview, this idea. So Daniel Dennett wrote a book that says Daniel Dennett doesn't exist. Hopefully the problem there is obvious. And why would you trust your brains anyway if they're just a result of neo-Darwinian processes? If our brains weren't intelligently designed, why should we trust them? Why should a bag of chemicals be able to perceive the universe accurately and draw true conclusions? You wouldn't expect that from chemical reactions, right? Can chemical reactions discern truth? If you're an atheist, that's all your thoughts are. Well, an atheist would say, I shouldn't generalize, some would say, Well, evolution provided us with well-functioning senses and brains, so that's how we can trust them. Well, let's look at that for a moment. You can make a counter-objection to his objection. And Alvin Plantinga, a Christian philosopher, actually wrote a quite long piece on this, pointing out that if our brains were the result of evolution, you can't trust them to perceive the universe accurately. Because evolution does not select, natural selection does not select for the ability to perceive accurately. Natural selection only selects for survivability. And he showed that that's not necessarily consistent with always perceiving things accurately. So if you believe we're the result of natural selection, you ultimately have no reason to believe your brain is giving you true information about the world around you. And this is circular reasoning anyway. Mr. Atheist, why can you trust our senses of brains if we're just a product of evolution? Well, we can trust our senses of brains because evolution is true and gave us good senses of brains. How do you know evolution is true? Well, we can trust evolution is true because we can perceive it with our senses of brains. See the problem there, right? Circular reasoning. Moreover, you can actually prove that from an atheistic perspective, you can't trust your own senses. Why is that? Well, supposedly, from this perspective, our thoughts would just be the result of the laws of chemistry. Our brains are bags of chemicals. Our thoughts are chemical reactions, right? Do chemicals have a choice about how they react with each other? When you mix things in a certain ratio in the laboratory, they always produce the same result, right? So the laws of chemistry dictate what happens with chemical reactions. If your thoughts are therefore merely chemical reactions, your thoughts also are obeying the laws of chemistry. That makes them predetermined, doesn't it? That means you don't actually have a choice about how your thoughts go. It's just a result of chemistry. That means free will is an illusion, according to atheism. However, as far as I know, we all perceive that we are actually making decisions every day and that we have free will of some sort, right? So we perceive that we're making decisions. Atheism says we're not actually doing that. Therefore, we can't even trust our own thinking. Atheism is misleading you about what's happening inside of your own head. Never mind about what's happening in the universe around you. Hopefully I didn't belabor that point too much, but hopefully you see the importance of this. The atheist can't even assert that he can accurately perceive the universe around us. That was the third assumption. Moving on to number 4. The universe must operate in an orderly fashion in order for science to be possible. Now, the Bible confirms that it does. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. The Lord created everything to operate according to patterns. So we can assume that it will continue to do that because he said that it would. Can the atheist make that assumption, though, not having the Bible as his foundation? Well, no, he can't. Because if he believes in the Big Bang, for example, he believes that the universe created itself. As I mentioned earlier, the Big Bang supposedly made matter, energy, space, and time. Time did not exist before the Big Bang, according to the model. So what created the universe? It did. It created itself. And importantly, time did not exist before that happened. Well, if there was no time before the universe began, could there have been a cause for the universe beginning? No, because a cause has to come before the effect, right? And if there was no time before the Big Bang, because time didn't start until the Big Bang, there was no before the Big Bang. So there could have been no cause for the universe to have created itself. Thus, no reason for it to occur, thus no reason to expect that the universe would exist. So if this is the implication of your thinking, as it would be for an atheist, can you therefore believe in an orderly universe? Without a cause, the universe's beginning must have been a random event. With no reason, no cause, whatever, it just happened. And some secular thinkers have even admitted this. As this one says, the universe is simply one of those things that happens from time to time. Is this a scientific statement? This cosmologist said maybe there was no ultimate cause for the universe. It just happened. It just happened. Is that a scientific statement? No, that's a denial of science. Every scientific discovery that's ever been made is based on the assumption that whatever I just saw happened for a reason, that it has a cause. You know, the famous story about Newton seeing something fall and saying, what's going on here, and then making conclusions. Or someone noticing that, hey, milkmaids that get cowpox never contract smallpox. Now, if you're going to be an atheist, ultimately you believe the universe popped into existence out of nothing for no reason, Do you have a right to assume that the universe will operate according to order afterwards? No, that's being inconsistent. A universe that had no reason for popping into existence doesn't necessarily going to operate according to reasons after that either. When a scientist sees something happens that's unexpected, if he says, it just happened. We live in a random chance universe after all. Does that make scientific progress possible or impossible? Objections to this, an atheist might say, but we do observe patterns in the universe anyway. We know the universe is orderly. Well, I agree that the universe is orderly, Mr. Atheist, but how can that be true coming from your worldview? And some secular thinkers I need to acknowledge this. This one said, it is not at all natural that laws of nature even exist, much less that man is able to discover them. And by the way, this man won the Nobel Prize in Physics. Moving on then, logical deduction must be possible. Laws of logic, are they real things? Can we rely on them? Well, the Bible says yes. Come now, let us reason together, saith the Lord. Logic is built into the creation. We can use it. It works. It's trustworthy. Because it comes from the Creator, it's a reflection of how He thinks. Therefore, we can trust that it's true. Even though it's abstract and non-physical, a law of logic is not a physical thing, right? Nevertheless, it exists. It's true. And it has an external source, the Creator. Thus, it can be universal, applying throughout the entire universe, and absolute. It always works with no violations. The atheist, however, not having the Bible as his foundation, has no actual basis for logic, because he believes reality is just made up of matter and energy. Only that which is material can ultimately be real if you're going to be a consistent atheist. That means you can't affirm the truth of laws of logic, because laws of logic aren't material things, right? There was a debate back in the 70s between Dr. Greg Bahnsen, a Christian, and Dr. Gordon Stein, who was an atheist, a militant atheist, and known for that. He was kind of the Richard Dawkins of his day. And Dr. Stein started and talked all the usual things in this kind of debate. Oh, Christianity is wrong because of this. God is evil in the Bible because of this. And he went on for a while during his time. And then Dr. Bahnsen said, I disagree with everything you just said, but before we even talk about that stuff, we need to talk about something more foundational. Can we use the laws of logic in our debate this evening? Dr. Stein didn't quite understand what he meant. And Dr. Bahnsen was explaining, well, you're an atheist, Dr. Stein, right? Yes. And you're a materialist, right? I know you are because I read your book. Yes. So you believe that only that which is material can exist, right? Yes. But laws of logic aren't material things, are they? What do you mean? Well, if you're telling me that nothing that is immaterial can be valid or exist, then laws of logic, being immaterial, can't actually exist or be real. So are you saying then that we can't use logic in our debate tonight? He didn't know how to answer that. And when it was Dr. Stein's turn, he kept trying to make arguments, and Dr. Bahnsen said, no. Before we can talk about that, we need ground rules. Can we use logic in our debate tonight or not? And of course, Dr. Stein had no answer for that. Dr. Bahnsen explained the way this all worked out. He said, Dr. Stein was there to promote a view that denies anything immaterial can be true. Laws of logic are immaterial, therefore he's ultimately denying the laws of logic. However, the debate is founded on using logic to contrast two opposing viewpoints. By coming to the debate, he endorsed the format of the debate, which endorses the laws of logic, which he was there to deny. So he lost the debate because he showed up. Now, an atheist might have objections to this. We can use logic because it works. Well, yes, Mr. Atheist, I agree that it works, but coming from your atheism, it shouldn't work. You have no foundation for believing in it. Some will say with a straight face, well, logic is just a human construct, a convention that we use. Well, if it's just something we make up, then we're free to make up other things too, right? Well, I can then make up a set of rules by which things can contradict each other, but they can still all be true at the same time. You wouldn't agree with that, would you? No. Therefore, it's not just a human construct. There has to be something absolute going on here. Some will say, well, I'm an atheist and I can use logic. Well, yes, you can. That's because you're an inconsistent atheist. If you really believed your own atheistic worldview, you'd understand you have no foundation for doing this. So logical deduction, therefore, not supported, from an atheistic worldview. Assumption 6, we must be able to trust mathematics. And I would love to do a whole talk on this, but I can't find any organization that will allow me to talk about it for an hour. Math is a fascinating thing and very relevant to this discussion because math is the language of physics. I mean, equations of physics are mathematical equations, right? The laws of physics. And math, being the language of physics, and physics has been said to describe the universe, the foundation of it. So you could argue math is actually the language of the universe. Now, as Christians, can we affirm that math works? That its concepts are real things? Well, yes, because the Bible uses mathematical concepts. For in 6 days, the Lord made heaven and earth. The Bible uses numbers. That tells us numbers are actual things that can be used. Heavens declare the glory of God. There's no speech or language where their voice is not heard. This language permeates the creation. Now, let me be clear here. We have various equations, and I'm going to talk more about these in a moment. We invent the symbols to express mathematics. All these various Greek letters and so on that we're applying in this context. But the underlying math that's being codified and formulated here actually permeates the universe, and the universe operates according to it. I mean, think about it. The blood flowing in your veins right now is obeying the mathematics of fluid dynamics. The thoughts in your head is obeying other mathematics. The air that we breathe is obeying the mathematics of statistical mechanics, excuse me. Drink water. Mathematics is so foundational and so ubiquitous throughout physics that this secular physicist wrote this book called The Mathematical Universe. He proposes that the universe is mathematics. He talks about the definition of mathematical structures and shows that the universe is set up that way. And I agree with actually most of what he said. Not all of it, because he's a materialist, and therefore would deny things like consciousness. But my point for now is mathematics is that fundamental. It's not merely a tool that we use, it permeates the creation itself. However, from a secular perspective, where did this come from? Before the Enlightenment, it's interesting to study the history of this, most thinkers recognized that God was the author of mathematics and built it into the fabric of creation itself. Therefore, it was our privilege to go discover it through the study of the world around us. After the Enlightenment, no one wanted a creator anymore. Therefore, mathematics was no longer something we discover, it's something we invent. Secular thinkers now are saying math isn't discovered because it's not built into the actual world around us. It's just something we invent. It's a fun mental game that mathematicians and physicists play. This author said math is the most original creation of the human spirit. This author said the mathematician is entirely free within the limits of his imagination to construct whatever worlds he pleases. He is not thereby discovering the fundamental principles of the universe, nor becoming acquainted with the ideas of God. So you see what his motivation is, right? But if math is a human invention, what does that mean? Well, what are numbers? Are numbers real things anymore? No, numbers are free creations of the human mind. Well, if we're just inventing things, we can invent them however we want, right? Does 2 + 2 really equal 4? Or am I free to just invent my own set of numbers where 2 + 2 equals the square root of 67? And if not, why is my free creation any less valid than yours? No, numbers are absolute things, not something we make up. This author said mathematics is a body of knowledge, but it contains no truths. Oh, thank you, sir. That's interesting. Mathematics contains no truths. Well, the laws of physics are mathematical equations. If math can contain no truths, you just denied the laws of physics and all of science, didn't you? And let's think about the implication of this. This set of equations here are called Maxwell's equations. I had to spend an entire year studying this as an engineering student. They were discovered, not invented, by James Clerk Maxwell, brilliant scientist of the 19th century. Did Nobel Prize worthy work. The Nobel Prize didn't exist in his day, but he could have won it multiple times in several different fields of physics. He was that brilliant. In 1873, he published a 2-volume treatise on electricity and magnetism, where he unified everything that was known of electricity and magnetism into one coherent mathematical framework. He was so ahead of his colleagues, it took them years to even understand the implications of everything he said. Finally, 10 years later, George Francis Fitzgerald wrote a couple papers talking about the energy loss by radiation from currents. He said, you know, if Maxwell's equations are correct, then in certain circumstances, when current is moving through a wire, we should see it losing energy into the surrounding environment. And he called that displacement currents. Subsequently, a few years later after that, Heinrich Hertz ran experiments and verified that this radiation of energy was occurring. Now today, we don't call these displacement currents, we call them radio waves. Now are radio waves real things? If you have a cell phone in your pocket, you better say yes, right? Now think about this, if Maxwell's equations were just a form of human creative expression like music or poetry, if Maxwell's equations were just Maxwell's poems, what does that mean? Well, were radio waves real things before Heinrich Hertz verified them experimentally, but after Fitzgerald realized that the math predicted them? We'd say yes, right? Radio waves were real things then? Well, why was the universe obligated to, if Maxwell's equations are just Maxwell's poems, why was the universe obligated to obey Maxwell's poems? Did the radio waves exist before that? I mean, we're already saying, first of all, from an atheistic perspective, that the universe has to be obedient to Maxwell's poems. But it's actually even worse than that if you think about it. If Maxwell's equations are just Maxwell's poems, were radio waves a real thing before Maxwell even formulated his equations? Yeah, we all say yes. So now not only does the universe have to obey Maxwell's poems, it had to know in advance that he would write the poetry so that it could therefore obey them. You see where this leads you, right? And some secular thinkers have struggled with this. This author said, why the external world should even obey the laws of logic, why in fact science should be possible, is not at all an easy question to answer. This Nobel Prize winner said, the miracle of the appropriateness of the language of mathematics for the formulation of the laws of physics is a wonderful gift, which we neither understand nor deserve. Well, we do understand it. Like you said, it's a miracle. It comes from the Creator. He said the enormous usefulness of mathematics and the natural sciences is something bordering on the mysterious, and there's no rational explanation for it. Not as an atheist, there's not. That's because your atheist worldview isn't true. The Creator made mathematics and built the cosmos according to it. That's why we can discover it. That's why it's there. That's why it works. But all atheism can offer is this: though devoid of truth, mathematics has given man miraculous powers over nature. It's the greatest paradox in human thought. If you were an atheist, would you be satisfied with that as a conclusion? I mean, I hope not. And it's good to see that at least some of them are scratching their heads over this. Now let's skip forward a little bit in the interest of time. So that's 6 of the 7 requirements. Now we'll talk about the last one, logical induction. What is induction? Well, induction is reasoning about conditions that you haven't observed yet. For example, does copper conduct electricity? It's not a trick question. Yes, it does, right? Okay, here's a question. Does all copper conduct electricity? Yes? How do you know? There might be copper in some rocks in Mars. We've never been there to test it. Would it conduct electricity if it were tested? We'd all say yes. What kind of reasoning are you using here? Inductive logic. You're taking things you do know and applying it to conditions you haven't tested yet, that you haven't observed yet. This is called induction. And if you think about it, it's fundamental to science, because every experiment, you're trying to figure out how the universe works, and then you make predictions based on your hypothesis. Well, aren't you assuming that the universe is going to work the same tomorrow as it is right now? To make your prediction at all, you have to make that assumption, right? Now, as Christians, we can make that assumption. Thus says the Lord, who gave the sun for a light by day and the ordinance of the moon and the stars for a light by night, etc. The Lord created things according to patterns, so we can trust the patterns are there to discover. Christ upholds all things by the word of his power. Again, we can assume the universe operates consistently. Therefore, induction and inductive reasoning is possible. The atheist, however, has no basis for induction. Because science requires uniformity, the universe has to behave uniformly through both time and space. But as we pointed out a moment ago, if the Big Bang had no cause, it's a random universe, so it should act randomly, right? But even beyond that, which we've already talked about, Skeptics actually have no reason to believe in induction as a reasoning method in the first place. And the first one to realize this was David Hume. Now, Hume passed away in 1776, so let me correct myself. I'm not sure if he passed away or if he published this in 76, but the point is, this is over 200 years ago by this point. He first realized something that's now known as Hume's problem of induction. Now, he was a skeptic and an empiricist. An empiricist means you only trust data. Data and observations are the foundation of your thinking, of your worldview. And most atheists today would like to think of themselves as being empiricists. However, if you're actually an empiricist and everything you know, or let me put it differently, everything you believe has to be founded in observations, then you have a problem with induction. Because if your view is empiricism, that all knowledge must come from sensory experience, well, let's return to our copper example. Copper we observe has conducted electricity in the past, every time we've observed it. But what about the copper on Mars? We haven't observed it, right? So if your belief system is only based on observations, you can make no call one way or the other about the copper on Mars, can you? Because whether it does conduct electricity or doesn't conduct electricity, both possibilities are consistent with the observations that you've made here on Earth. Therefore, you can't say one way or the other, which means you can't make this inductive reasoning here. So you can't apply induction through space. You can't apply induction to conditions elsewhere other than the places you've observed, nor can you apply it through time. Will copper conduct electricity tomorrow? An empiricist can't say yes, because he hasn't observed it tomorrow yet. And whether it does or it doesn't tomorrow, both options are consistent with his observations today, so therefore he'd have to shrug and say, I don't know. Ultimately, an atheist has no basis for induction. Is that clear how that works? I know we're getting kind of abstract here in my last point. We've already said that science requires uniformity, etc. Skeptics have no reason to believe in this as a form of logical reasoning. Now, an atheist might object to this and say, wait a minute, we can use induction because it works. Well, I agree that it works, Mr. Atheist, but how could it work if your worldview is true? You have no reason to believe that it does. Sometimes they'll say, well, we can use induction because it's always worked in the past. Here's where it gets kind of sticky, and bear with me here. That is circular reasoning, and here's why. Induction through time is something we've already mentioned, that in the past we've observed that copper conducts electricity, therefore in the future we can conclude that it will continue to do so. Is this valid reasoning? It's actually incomplete reasoning. In order for this to be valid reasoning through induction, you have to make an assumption in the middle here, that the future will continue to be like the past. Do you agree that that assumption is necessary to use induction? So the formula goes like this. In the past, we have observed such and such. In order to say that in the future we will continue to observe such and such, you have to assume that the future will continue to be like the past, right? And let me skip forward through some examples here out of the interest of time. So that formula has that assumption right in the middle. Okay. Ask an atheist, why is induction valid? If he says we can use it because it's always worked in the past, no, that doesn't work. Why not? Because he's saying this, in the past, we have always observed that the future has continued to be like the past. Therefore, he wants to conclude that in the future, it will still be that the future will continue to be like the past. But again, he's making an implicit assumption here that he's not recognizing. He has to assume, to make this conclusion, what? He has to assume the thing he's trying to prove. So this is circular reasoning and therefore invalid. I know that one got kind of abstract there. I apologize for that, but it's an important point. An atheist has no reason to believe that induction can work. Therefore, he can't do science. I mean, a chemist is working in the laboratory and makes a discovery. She has no reason to believe that the laws of physics are going to work the same in the colleague's lab down the hall. Or for that matter, maybe she goes to lunch and comes back and has to retest everything because the laws of physics change in the meanwhile. That's where you wind up with. Hume actually acknowledged that he had no reason to expect the sun to come up every morning. He said it always has, but without induction, I can't say that it always will. He also acknowledged that you couldn't live that way, incidentally. He said, because, you know, bread was not poisoned when I ate it at breakfast, and maybe it will be poisoned at lunchtime. So even he acknowledged that although he had no reason to believe in it, he still had to accept it as truth. And that was the seventh of our seven assumptions, which crumbled just like all the rest of them did. We see, therefore, Christianity affirms the requirements of science, all seven of those assumptions. Atheism, however, denies them. And there's practical implications of this too. Some people have wondered, why is it that Europe wound up colonizing so much of the world the way that it did? And a lot of that was because the technology they had. Where did the technology come from? You could argue that Europe shouldn't have been the leader in a lot of that in history, because other civilizations had a head start. I mean, China had gunpowder, paper, movable type, the compass, long before such things were in Europe. India had wealth, the stability of a culture that could support scientific discovery. They discovered zero, which is an important concept of math. Even Islamic cultures made great advances in math and so on, yet none of these took over the world where Europe mostly did. Why is that? Because Europeans, by and large, had this in their culture. Not that everyone was a Christian necessarily, but the culture was Judeo-Christian. They believed that the Bible was true. Therefore, they had a foundation for science and could actually discover more of it. For example, Islamic countries tend to be stillborn in science because they're very fatalistic in their view of things. When things happen, they don't assume that there's a reason things happened. Everything happens because Allah wants it to happen. So if you drop a rock on your foot doesn't hurt because you dropped a rock on it. Your foot hurts because Allah wanted it to hurt. If that's your thinking, can you make scientific progress? No. Which is why most Islamic countries have not. This author said, people take it for granted that the physical world is both ordered and intelligible. The underlying order in nature, the laws of physics, are simply accepted as given, as brute facts. Nobody asks where they came from. At least they don't do so in polite company. However, even the most atheistic scientist accepts as an act of faith that the universe is not absurd, that there's rational basis for physical existence, manifested as law-like order, in nature that is at least partly comprehensible to us. So science can proceed only if the scientist adopts an essentially theological worldview. I'm not quoting a creationist here, by the way. Indeed, we see that the major figures in the development of science all had a Christian worldview. Now, some of their theological worldviews, one or two of them had some ideas that some of us might scratch our heads over today and disagree with, but overall, they still understood that the Bible was trustworthy and that we could therefore make certain assumptions about the world around us, and from that, make scientific progress. As Johannes Kepler said, we see how God, like a human architect, approached the founding of the world according to order and rule, and measured everything in such a manner, let my name perish if only the name of God the Father is thereby elevated. And Kepler discovered the laws of orbital mechanics, which are then foundational to the discovery of physics and calculus and all sorts of other things. Brilliant, brilliant scientist. What's his motivation? To honor God through his work. So we saw 7 requirements for science to be possible. You may or may not remember that I said I was going to come back to the first one at the end of my talk here. Does the universe exist? As Christians, we can say yes. I mentioned that the atheist ultimately cannot. I didn't give a whole lot of reason why. So let's talk about that as our final point. What's the logical conclusion of atheistic cosmology? Even if all the other stuff I talked about wasn't a problem for them, where are you going to wind up if you're consistently applying atheistic cosmology and seeing where it goes? Even if something could come from nothing, and something did come from nothing, etc., you don't wind up with the universe today where we're all looking at it. Instead, you wind up with something called ultimate brains. What is that? Some have seen my video already. This is the last thing I talk about in volume 3. And I'd like to talk about this more than I do, but most people don't believe that it's true. You'll see why. The logical conclusion of atheistic cosmology is not that there was a Big Bang which made energy, which made matter, which made stars, planets, life, etc. What the math actually says is that the universe doesn't exist. That it is much more likely that instead of this something coming from nothing being a Big Bang universe, that a single brain popped into existence from nothing, complete with all the molecules arranged in such a way that it has false memories of being a person who lived a life to that point, and complete with false sensory input, perceiving a world around itself that doesn't really exist. Yeah, I know this is silly, but bear with me. This is what it actually says. As this author here says, this could be the weirdest and most embarrassing prediction in the history of cosmology, if not science itself. If true, it would mean that you yourself are more likely to be some momentary fluctuation in the field of matter and energy out in space than being a person with a real past in an orderly star-spangled cosmos. Your memories and the world you think you see around yourself are illusions. This bizarre picture is the outcome of a recent series of calculations that take some of the bedrock theories and discoveries of modern cosmology to the limit. The basic problem is that it's hard for nature to make a whole universe. It's much easier to make fragments of one, like planets, yourself maybe in a spacesuit, or even, in the most absurd and troubling example, a naked brain floating in space. Nature tends to do what is easiest from the standpoint of energy and probability, and so these fragments, in particular the brains, would appear far more frequently than real full-fledged universes, or than us, or they might be us. Alan Guth, a cosmologist at MIT, who, by the way, is a rock star in cosmology, he invented inflationary theory, which is a foundational part of the Big Bang model today, who agrees this overabundance is absurd, pointed out that some calculations result in an infinite number of free-floating brains for every normal brain, making it, quote, infinitely unlikely for us to be normal brains, unquote. Normal brain, what he means by that is physical brain in a physical body in a physical universe that got here through, normal processes. As opposed to the idea of a brain floating in space. So let me emphasize this again. Modern cosmology, the math actually says it's infinitely unlikely for you to be a normal person with a normal brain. The odds are 1 out of infinity. What do you get when you divide by infinity? 0. So cosmology actually says there's a 0% chance that you're sitting in this room, in a real room, on a real planet, in a real solar system, etc. You're just a brain floating in the void. Notice, by the way, I'm not saying that you're a brain floating in the cosmos, because there is no cosmos. It's just you. The name comes from Ludwig Boltzmann, a physicist of over 100 plus years ago. He didn't come up with this idea, but the math comes from his work. Thus, these are called Boltzmann brains. And I know what you're thinking. The question you're asking, the answer is no. No, I'm not actually making this up. Cosmologists are actually struggling with this problem in their theories now. Here's only some of the papers about it. Can the Higgs boson save us from the menace of the Boltzmann brains? Boltzmann brains and the scale factor cutoff measure of the multiverse. Return to the Boltzmann brains. They thought they had solved the problem for a while, but it turns out they didn't. There's more papers I could quote. I will point out, though, I had to dig deep in the cosmological literature to find these papers. This is not a problem that they like to talk about publicly. I mean, would you? If this is what your model actually predicted? That it's infinitely more likely that you're just a brain floating in the void and that there's no other reality other than that? Note too what this indicates. If you're just a brain floating in the void, which is infinitely more likely than you being a real person, according to the math, that means there's no universe around you, right? So the logical conclusion of atheistic cosmology is that there's no universe at all, it doesn't exist. And obviously, if that's where it goes, you can't do science either now, can you? The Bible says the fool has said in his heart that there is no God. That's why you see the foolishness of a lot of the implications of atheism. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying atheists are stupid. These are very intelligent men and women. But the Bible says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. When you deny the truth, whatever you wind up believing is going to be a lie, right? When you deny wisdom as the foundation of your thinking, as the basis of your worldview, whatever it is you wind up believing is going to be foolishness. And indeed, that's where the atheist finds himself. When an atheist tries to use science, logic, etc. against the Christian worldview, he has to assume the Christian worldview is true. Otherwise, he couldn't use science logic in the first place. Like the person who sent you an email denying that email exists. This author says, the unbeliever is thus able to think and work only on the basis of a practical reason which presupposes the Christian frame of things. He has no knowledge on the basis of his own atheistic principles. He has valid knowledge only as a thief possesses stolen goods. So for an atheist to try to use science and logic in an argument, he's actually discrediting his own worldview. He thinks science gives him a great weapon to use against biblical Christianity, but in reality, the only weapon it gives him is this one. That's because the heavens do not declare that they came from the Big Bang billions of years ago. The heavens declare the glory of God. The way it works, the mathematics within it, even the logic used to perceive it, and the trustworthiness of our senses, all come from our Creator. You probably have gathered by now this is a rather unusual perspective on some of these topics. So if you like this kind of thing, and I'm assuming you do because you're here at this meeting, I have a free email newsletter that's available on my website. I'll show you the URL for that in just a moment. You can sign up there. Again, it's free. You won't get spammed. It's only a couple issues a year lately. But when different things are announced in the media and so on, and there's more to the story than what you're being told in those reports, that's what the email is for. It's already been mentioned that there's DVDs in the back table. These, unlike tonight's talk, these are more evidence-based. The first volume goes through every planet in the solar system, terrestrial planets and gas giants, shows that each one, along with many of the moons, actually discredit secular ideas about origins. Volume 2 discovers about, Volume 2 talks about stars and galaxies. Where do they come from? What does science tell us about that? What does the cosmos tell us about our Creator? Volume 3 is about the Big Bang itself, the entire universe. Where did it come from? Is the Big Bang a good model? No. Some of the material you heard tonight came from that. And Boltzmann brains are actually the last part of this video and goes into a little more depth of what I had time to do tonight. So my website is creationastronomy.com. That's where the email newsletter sign up is. And also the same videos that are out there on the table are available here in digital format for a bit cheaper. And I would recommend that to you. If it doesn't matter what you get, go with the digital because they're in higher resolution than what a DVD can support. That is the end of my talk. I thank you for your time and attention. And there we go.
There we go. Thank you, Spike. That was very interesting.
Very good. I hope so.
So we would like to do some Q&A, questions and answers. So technically we have to be out of the building in 40 minutes. So why don't we do about 10 minutes of questions and answers, and then Spike can retire back to his table there and talk to people one-on-one if you've got additional questions. And in the meantime, we're going to pass some baskets around to take donations for Rocky Mountain Creation Fellowship. So with that, let's see, I'll bring you the mic so you can.
Could you tell us about your faith journey from atheism to belief?
It was a journey, not an event. It began when I was working in the space program, and a friend of mine saw me reading a New Agey kind of book one day and asked if I believed it. I said, I don't know, just something I'm reading. And that got us to talking about origins. And I found out he was not only a Christian, but also a creationist. And I knew Christians, but I had never met a creationist before. And my view of creationism was that which I picked up from my secular humanist heroes, Carl Sagan, Isaac Asimov, Bertrand Russell, all those guys. So I was kind of puzzled as to how a man working with us could believe what he believed. So I asked him, how do you deny all the obvious evidence for evolution? And he said, what obvious evidence is that? So I started talking about fossil sequences and Darwinian processes, and millions of years and dating methods and all the rest of it. I didn't know it at the time. He is a friend now. Actually, I was hoping to see him here at the meeting. He lives in Colorado Springs, where I used to live. He has an entire bedroom of his house is his library. Most of it's apologetics. So here's the Jehovah's Witness section, here's the Mormon section, here's the creation section. So he was very well informed on all this stuff. And as I challenged him on various things, he shot every argument down. And I'd never heard any of that stuff before. And he's very gracious about it. He didn't say, well, that's wrong. He'd say, you know, you should go look into that. They threw that one out about 3 years ago. I'd go look and sure enough, it's right. So over a few months, as we had lunch and whatever, I challenged him, and he'd keep answering and defanging my challenge. And I eventually ran out of things to ask. And he noticed, and he said, well, I've answered your questions, I need to answer mine. So that's fair. He said, you believe in the laws of physics, don't you? I said, well, yeah, we use them here every day. And he says, well, how do you reconcile those with the Big Bang model? And he didn't even explain what he meant. But as I thought about the question, I ultimately realized that the secular dilemma thing that I told you about, did the universe have a beginning? Yes or no? Both options are bad. If you don't want to accept a creator. I found myself on the horns of that dilemma. He didn't phrase the question quite the way I did, but that's what I boiled it down to talk about now. And I realized that I was believing in two mutually incompatible things, apparently, physics and the Big Bang. And so what had been, for me, like a fun exercise in trying to find a problem with him, now became a problem with me. So that's when I got serious about it and really started digging in. And he kept asking questions that I had no answer for. And I go back and look at my textbooks and no longer accepting conclusions, trying to support the reasoning that got there. And suddenly all these holes were opening up. And I'm saying, what happened to my textbooks? They were fine a couple of years ago. But now I'm seeing all these assumptions and hand waving and all the rest of it. Meanwhile, I was going to school down at UCCBS for a master's in physics and taking space-related classes as I could because that was my day job. And being sensitive to some of these issues now, having talked with him, I'm seeing other things open up, even in classes that are just about physics. So we're talking about specific aspects of physics now, and I'm realizing, well, if that's true, and I know it's true because we just did the math, then this part of the origin model for the solar system is wrong. So I was getting beat up from a couple different sides, basically, the classes at night and then during the day. And after months of me trying to disprove his worldview and try to shore up my own, this is months and months, almost a year. Meanwhile, he had been also bringing in books on the historicity of the Bible by Josh McDowell and all those kinds of things. So I'd never heard any of that stuff. And I eventually came to the conclusion, well, creation has to be right. Yes, there was a global flood. Big Bang doesn't work. Things are young, all the rest of it. But I don't want any of that to be true. Because if that stuff is true, then there's a creator to whom I'm accountable and against whom I've been sinning my whole life, which means I've been heaping up wrath for myself, and that's what I'm going to get if creation is true. So to me, it was a chain of dominoes. The first one says creation is true. The last one says I get wrath. And all the rest fall automatically once the first one goes over. So for a while, I was torn between two options that were both bad. I either continue to affirm a worldview that I now understood was no longer, couldn't be true, or I do this other one, which I didn't want either. So I was stuck in the middle for a while, which is very disorienting, not having an actual worldview, until I realized, wait a minute, I heard the gospel at age 12 and rejected it because science showed there was no God. Say, oh, wait a minute. Yes, creation is true and everything else follows, but this also means that the gospel you heard at age 12 is true. Yes, you're a sinner. Yes, you deserve wrath. God knows your sin better than you do, but loves you enough despite it all to have sent his son to pay for it. So it's like, why am I fighting this? This truly is the good news. What better news could there be? So I believe in creation first, without being a Christian. Now, I usually begin to talk with mentioning that briefly. Being a creationist is not sufficient to make one a Christian. I don't want you to misunderstand what I'm saying. But creation is a stumbling block for so many, which is why our MCF and other groups have these meetings. So I apologize for the several minutes it took us to say all that, but that's the question.
My question is rather simple. So you used copper wire as an example when you were talking about induction. Why was that not a coiled wire?
I'm sorry? Why is it not a coil?
Why was that not a coiled wire? You were talking about induction.
Took me a minute. Okay. For non-electronics people, a coil of wire, yeah. Inductors aren't actually used much in electronics. Capacitors are much more complicated. Whatever. We won't go there. Anybody else? Everyone's still stunned from the Boltzmann rings thing. Let's get.
The Boltzmann brains, I'm under the belief that there is no information and computing and memories inside the brain. The brain is a conduit to the mind, and the mind's part of the spirit. So I think with the Boltzmann brains, you still wouldn't have what they were hoping you would have. Could you comment on that?
They're coming at it from a different perspective than we are, though. As atheists, they have to be materialists, that there's a physical event that could only produce something physical, which is why they think our thoughts are just chemical reactions and so on. So they believe that consciousness can appear in matter. Therefore, a human brain could pop into existence from nothing and still have thoughts inside of it and so on. So I disagree with that, as I understand you do, and hopefully all of us would, because we're not materialists, but they are, and so they think that that's a good line of reasoning, I guess I could say. Does that answer your question?
This is real silly, but we've been talking here. How do they explain how a Boltzmann brain lives? What do you feed a Boltzmann brain?
It doesn't live.
Pardon?
It doesn't live.
What does it do?
It dissolves back into the quantum goo that it came from.
Okay.
Okay, so think about this. How do you perceive living? You're only ever living one moment at a time. You perceive that you were living a moment ago too. You perceive it as a continuum. But the materialist thinks your thoughts are just your memories rather are just a result of the way the molecules are arranged in your brain. So your brain, again, that you're the only one that exists. You popped into existence a microsecond ago, and your illusion of having lived a continuous life until now is an illusion. The molecules just happen to be arranged in a way that you remember a life that never actually happened.
He didn't say.
But this is what the math leads to, which is why no one wants to talk about it.
Thank you. You mentioned in one of the articles that there was something that was supposed to save us from the Boltzmann brain. What was that prior?
I don't remember. That was a few years ago. The only way out of it that I've seen is they try to, instead of the one out of infinity, they try to make an infinity out of infinity. So they're trying to just say that the math is nonsense. But you don't actually need that math to show, you don't even need the infinity in there to still say that it's overwhelmingly likely that we're Boltzmann brains. I don't know, boy, I'm really tempted to go into this further, but we can talk more at the table if you'd like. Because I don't want to, if someone has a different question, I don't want to.
Yeah, we got about another minute for questions.
One last question then? There's a hand way in the back. Sorry. I just wanted to see Rob Trot down there.
So when they're talking about the quantum flux that created the Big Bang, where exactly did the quantum flux come from?
That's a sticking point in a lot of this. There's a bait and switch going on. There are cosmologists who will say that the laws of physics support something coming from nothing, but they redefine the word nothing. They don't mean nothing as the absence of anything. They mean nothing as an existing vacuum of space-time that doesn't happen to have any particles in the right. And so Lawrence Krauss wrote a whole book of it called Something from the Universe from Nothing, bestseller. Now, if you buy a book called The Universe from Nothing, what do you expect it's going to explain? How the universe came from nothing? But right out of the gate, you understand when he says nothing, he doesn't really mean nothing. So they're still assuming that something pre-existed. There was a vacuum of space-time that had the capability of fluctuating, that had these unrealized potential of fields within it that can fluctuate and make a universe out of it. So really, they're getting back to the second answer in the dilemma, which is there's always been something. Or else they'll just dodge and say, well, we don't know what happened before the Big Bang. That question's outside of science. So what you're admitting then is you don't really have a full scientific model. Did that answer your question? Okay.
I just learned that we can leave maybe a little later than 9:30. So I think we can give them another 5 minutes or so for public questions and answers, and then that'll give you a chance to keep Spike up really late tonight so that he'll be all ready to travel tomorrow. So, so you've been trying to get a question.
How do you present this to a postmodern thinker who believes you can hold two contradictory truths at the same time, and that they base everything more on emotions. How would you present this to them?
I would welcome your thoughts. It's very difficult. And all I can say is, I think a certain way, and so I can communicate with people who think like me. And people who don't think like me will need someone else other than me to talk to them. For what maybe I'm just avoiding, that, but I don't know. It's an excellent question. It's so much is emotionally driven nowadays, and yeah, it's difficult.
I was actually going to comment on your question about emotions and type, and like this is something I learned at a Worldview Academy this summer, and it would be for like the really extreme case where like they're saying my emotions are truth, but it would be to show them where their worldview contradicts their emotions. And it's like, I mean, it's a delicate process. You have to like figure out where they're like, I feel like this, but then you show them their worldview saying the exact opposite of that. And that really throws them off.
I'd like to hear a presentation just on that.
I would not be the person to give that.
Oh,
I thought he was pointing to John. In your talk or on your videos, you mentioned the multiverse.
Yes.
Does that have anything to do with any of this?
Multiverse is usually the preferred solution to cosmic fine tuning. That was actually the talk I gave at the previous group last night. It's not directly related to this, other than except for the fact that it's inconsistent. It's ultimately a supernatural explanation from people who deny the supernatural explanations are valid. But that's not directly the result of an atheistic worldview, which is what I've tried to limit my scope to tonight. So yeah, multiverse is certainly worth talking about. I just didn't cover it tonight because it just wasn't as directly applicable.
I'd like to read one verse, Hebrews 11:3. Through faith, we understand that the worlds were framed by the word or utterance of God, so that things which are seen were not made of things which do appear. The material world that we observe did not pop out of nothing. It came from the utterance of God. Therefore, E equals mc squared, the utterance, the energy, produced what we see in the physical world. So we also believe that the world had a beginning, but there was a creator who existed before material things happened.
Yes.
Thank you.
Excellent.
How long did the vacuum space flux time exist in time?
Well, before the Big Bang, there was no time.
And there was no flux time space thing.
I'm not saying they have a consistent answer. I'm just getting playing what the answer is. Yeah. There was no then. So some people would, actually, while we're talking about this, if you try to talk about the dilemma with other people, and again, I hope you remember that section because I think it's the most practical thing I shared tonight. Sometimes you get the answer, well, there's always been something, but it's the eternal cycle. There's a big bang, and then the bang slows down, and it turns into a contraction and then a big crunch, which rebounds, and then bang, crunch, eternally. So we just happen to be in one iteration of that cycle. So people who take that tack would answer your question by saying, well, there's always been something going back eternally in the past, the fluctuations, the brief punctuation, etc. If someone uses that objection with you, the answer to it is twofold. Number one, that's a perpetual motion machine, which physics doesn't allow. You can't have an eternal cycle of bang, crunch forever. I mean, if you drop a basketball, does it bounce forever? No. There's reasons for that. And physics doesn't allow that to happen. And the second problem with that view is that you can't believe that and the Big Bang model at the same time, because the Big Bang model today includes dark energy, which is accelerating the expansion of the universe. That cycle thing requires the bang to slow down and then stop and then reverse. But Big Bang cosmologists today believe the expansion is actually accelerating. Not only is the universe still expanding, it's expanding faster and faster, which is the opposite of what that cycle thing needs. So that's not a direct answer to your question, but it is related. And I want to mention that in case anyone tries to use that as a conversation point with people. I'm leaving it to you as to when we end this. So.
Yeah, we're getting very close.
Okay.
Okay, I'm just struggling a little bit. If the materialists believe in this Boltzmann brain thing that tells me that my perception of this chair is just some fluctuation out there, and it's not real matter and not real physics and not, it's just a thought. I'm in the matrix or whatever. Well, why would a materialist want to go there? I mean,
They don't go there.
okay,
I'm not saying anybody believes this.
okay,
They all acknowledge this is absurd.
okay,
But this is where their model, this is what the model says, but they're denying the conclusion.
okay,
And I've seen several people say something to the effect of, well, this is what the math says, but that conclusion is clearly absurd. So we can't be Boltzmann brains. There has to be a real universe here. So they're not accepting what their own model predicts,
okay.
is what's happening.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.